Whoa, did you see Corcept Therapeutics yesterday?
Yeah, what a day for Corset, huh? Up
Yeah.
over 85% on Monday.
March 31st, 2025 to be exact. It even hit $95.42 intraday.
Wild. I mean, really makes you wonder what's going on behind the scenes, right?
Absolutely, and that's precisely why we're diving in today. Based on your request, we are doing a deep dive into Corcept Therapeutics.
Looking past the daily noise to get a real feel for the company.
Exactly. What do they do? How do they make money? Are they on solid ground? What's the market thinking? And what are the risks and the opportunities ahead?
Sounds like a plan.
We've got a ton of research lined up, too. Their business model, financials, market position, recent news, you name it. And we even tapped into some expert analysis to get a well-rounded picture.
So the mission is to cut through all that noise and really get to the core of Corcept's long-term potential.
Precisely. All right, so where do we even begin with a company like this?
Well, I think the first thing is, what does Corcept actually do? What's their business all about?
Okay, so they're a biopharmaceutical company, but they're focused on something very specific: modulating the effects of cortisol.
Cortisol. Okay, so that's the stress hormone.
Right, exactly. But it's not just about stress. Cortisol plays a huge role in so many bodily functions. Endocrine system, obviously, but also oncologic, metabolic, even neurologic systems.
Wow, so they're developing drugs that essentially fine-tune how cortisol works in the body.
That's the idea, and they're targeting some serious conditions.
So where does their money come from right now?
So their primary revenue driver is a drug called Korlym.
Korlym, okay.
It's their brand name for mifepristone in this specific application, and it got FDA approval back in 2012.
Interesting.
But it's important to note, this isn't the same low-dose mifepristone used in medication abortion. This is a higher dose specifically approved for managing hyperglycemia.
High blood sugar.
Exactly. In adults with Cushing's syndrome.
Okay. Now, Cushing's syndrome, is that the one where the body produces too much cortisol?
You got it. It's a rare endocrine disorder. And the patients they're targeting also have to have type 2 diabetes or glucose intolerance, and surgery either hasn't worked or isn't an option. So Korlym was actually the very first FDA-approved treatment for this specific group of patients.
First to market, huh? That's a big deal in the pharmaceutical world.
Huge. So their business model basically revolves around developing these unique drugs and then selling them directly, mainly in the U.S.
Makes sense.
And they also offer patient support services, which, again, makes sense given the complexity of the condition.
All right, so that's the present. What about future growth? Where's that coming from?
That's where their pipeline comes in.
The pipeline. Okay.
Their most promising candidate right now is relacorilant.
Relacorilant, another cortisol modulator.
It is, but it's what they call selective. Think of it like a dimmer switch for cortisol's effects.
Instead of just blocking it entirely.
Exactly, because cortisol does so much in the body. Broad blocking can cause all sorts of side effects. That's why this selective approach is so important. So it's in late-stage development for Cushing's syndrome. But here's where it gets really interesting. They're also looking at its potential in treating ovarian and prostate cancer.
Wow, that's a much broader scope.
Right. And they've actually already submitted an NDA, a new drug application to the FDA for relacorilant specifically for hypercortisolism.
Which is kind of the root cause of Cushing's, right?
Exactly. And the FDA has set a target decision date, a PDUFA date, of December 30th, 2025.
So that's a big date to watch.
Absolutely. The market's definitely paying attention. And you know that high PE ratio we mentioned. That's despite their strong current earnings.
So the market is really banking on the future potential of that pipeline.
Especially relacorilant, yeah. They're buying into the possibility of huge growth down the line.
Interesting. So beyond relacorilant, are there other drugs in development?
Yeah, they've got a couple of other interesting candidates in earlier stages. There's miricorilant, which is in phase 2 trials for NASH, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. It's a liver condition. And they're also looking at it for weight gain caused by antipsychotic meds.
Okay.
Then there's dazucorilant. This one had kind of mixed results in a phase 2 trial for ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. It didn't meet its primary endpoint, but they did see a statistically significant improvement in overall survival in the high-dose group at 24 weeks.
So not a complete failure, but not the home run they were hoping for.
Right. But even those earlier stage candidates like miricorilant for NASH and weight gain, it shows they're thinking about diversifying their focus.
Okay, so they're definitely not one of the big pharma giants. Where do they fit in the overall market?
They're more of a niche player, for sure, very focused on this whole cortisol modulation space. But within that niche, they've got a pretty strong position, especially in the treatment of Cushing's syndrome with Korlym.
Right.
Their market cap was somewhere between 5.76 billion and 6.01 billion as of late March 2025.
So not tiny, but not huge either.
Exactly. But they're definitely a force to be reckoned with in their specific area.
So what would you say is their core value proposition? What are they really bringing to the table?
I think it comes down to their ability to unlock the potential of cortisol modulation. They're developing innovative treatments for diseases that have been really hard to tackle.
Like Cushing's.
Right. Korlym was the first FDA-approved drug for hyperglycemia in that specific subset of Cushing's patients. And with their pipeline, especially relacorilant, they're hoping to develop treatments that have even fewer side effects.
Because of that selective blocking approach.
Exactly. So to sum it up, Corcept develops and sells drugs that modulate cortisol activity. Right now, most of their revenue comes from Korlym for Cushing's syndrome. But they're banking on their pipeline, particularly relacorilant, to bring in significant revenue in the future, if those drugs get approved and make it to market, of course.
Okay, so we have a pretty good handle on what Corcept does, but who's actually running the show?
Right, who's steering the ship?
Yeah. The management team, how might their actions impact the company's future?
Well, the CEO is Joseph K. Belanoff, MD.
Okay.
He's been CEO since 1999.
Wow, it's a long time.
Yeah, it is. Think about that. He's been there through the entire development and launch of Korlym, the expansion of the pipeline, everything.
So he must have a ton of experience.
Definitely. Deep knowledge of the market. But, it can also be a double-edged sword. Sometimes that long tenure can lead to resistance to new ideas or, maybe missing some emerging challenges.
Right.
And there are a couple of other things that stand out when you look at the management team.
Like what?
Recently, there's been some insider stock selling by the CEO and other executives. Now, insider selling doesn't always mean bad news. People have their own reasons for selling stock. But investors definitely keep a close eye on it.
Understandably.
And then you look at employee reviews on sites like Comparably. The feedback on the CEO and the executive team is kind of mixed. Not terrible, but definitely in the bottom quartile compared to similar-sized companies.
So potentially some issues with leadership or company culture?
Could be.
How has the management team dealt with past challenges or setbacks?
Well, they're in the middle of some pretty big legal battles right now. There's the patent litigation with Teva Pharmaceuticals over Korlym.
Teva. They're a generic drug maker.
Yep. And then there's a lawsuit from a group of health insurers. They're alleging that Corcept did some shady stuff to extend their patent protection for Korlym and block generic competition.
Ouch. So how did management respond to all that?
Well, they were pretty vocal about their disappointment after losing the patent case to Teva back in December 2023.
Yeah.
But they also said they're confident they'll win the appeal, and they're committed to protecting their intellectual property, so they're definitely not backing down.
Seems like they're taking an aggressive stance.
Definitely.
Okay, so what about transparency? How do they communicate with investors and the public?
They do seem to have a pretty active investor relations operation. Their website's got press releases, SEC filings, transcripts of earnings calls, investor presentations, the whole 9 yards.
It's thorough.
They've also got email alerts, so you can stay up to date on their financial performance clinical trials and other corporate news. Plus, the CEO's been pretty vocal in news articles talking about drug pricing and the legal stuff, so they're putting themselves out there.
So they seem to be making an effort to be open. But transparency is more than just putting information out there. What about their ethical track record?
Yeah, that's where things get a little murky. The pricing of Korlym has been a big source of controversy.
How so?
People have pointed out the massive price difference between Korlym and mifepristone, which, remember, is the same active ingredient, just a lower dose for medication abortion.
Right.
So some people are accusing them of price gouging, especially since it's a drug for a rare condition. And then there's that lawsuit from the health insurers alleging patent manipulation.
Yeah.
If that's true, that raises serious ethical questions about their business practices.
Yeah, that's not good.
And there were even rumors in the past, which the company denied, about them giving kickbacks to doctors to prescribe Korlym. But on the flip side, they do have a code of ethics for employees and directors outlining ethical and honest conduct. So it's a bit of a mixed bag.
So are they honest, capable, shareholder-oriented?
It's tough to say definitively. The questions about drug pricing and the patent stuff are red flags for sure. In terms of capability, they've definitely proven they can develop and sell a drug and advance their pipeline. But shareholder-oriented, that's a tougher one.
How so?
Well, they have done share buybacks, which can be good for shareholders. But then there's that reason insider selling and the not-so-great employee reviews. It makes you wonder if there are internal issues that could hurt shareholders in the long run.
All right, so we've got a sense of their business, their leadership. What about their financials? How healthy are they?
So let's dive into the numbers. We already mentioned their market cap is somewhere between 5.76 and 6.01 billion. Now their price to earnings ratio, their PE ratio, is between 44 and 46. That's way higher than the industry median, which is around 18.5.
A high PE ratio can mean the stock is overvalued, right?
Or it could mean the market expects their earnings to grow significantly in the future.
Okay, so what about their actual growth and profitability?
They've definitely been growing. Their revenue was up a whopping 40% in 2024, reaching $675 million. And their profit margins are really strong. Gross profit margin around 98.4%, operating margin between 20 and 24%, and net profit margin somewhere between 17 and 21%.
Wow, those are healthy numbers.
They are.
What about debt? Are they loaded up with loans?
Nope, that's another plus. Their debt-to-equity ratio is practically zero, somewhere between 0 and 0.01. So they're not relying on borrowing to fund their operations.
Good. What about cash flow? Are they generating enough cash to keep things running smoothly and fuel their growth?
Yes, they are. They reported free cash flow of $87.2 million for fiscal year 2023 and $59.18 million just in the fourth quarter of 2024. And their price-to-free cash flow ratio looks reasonable, too. One last metric to consider is their price-to-book ratio, which is between 3.2 and 9.11.
So the takeaway here is strong growth, high profitability, minimal debt, and positive cash flow. But that high PE ratio suggests they might be a little pricey.
Exactly. So to answer your question, are they profitable with a strong balance sheet? Yes. They had a net income of $141.2 million in 2024, and they've got a ton of cash and investments on hand, over $600 million at the end of 2024, with very little debt.
So financially, they're in a good place.
Yeah.
But what about the consistency of their earnings?
Over the past 5 years, their revenue has been steadily climbing, and their net income has mostly followed suit. But there was a little dip in net income in the last quarter of 2024 compared to the previous year, and they missed analyst expectations for earnings per share in the first quarter of 2025, so there's been some recent volatility.
Okay. And are they paying dividends?
No dividends at the moment. It seems like they're focusing on reinvesting in research and development and those share buybacks we talked about.
Okay. Any other concerns about their financial stability, like too much debt or poor working capital management?
No, not really. Their debt levels are very low, as we said, and they seem to be managing their short-term assets and liabilities well. Their current ratio, a measure of short-term liquidity, has been consistently above 3, which is a good sign,
Right.
and their total working capital increased nicely in 2023. So some earnings bumps, but no major red flags. All right, before we jump into the second half where we'll cover market sentiment, ownership structure, and risks, let's talk about how you can get this level of insight whenever you need it.
Sounds good.
Imagine being able to generate a detailed report, a podcast segment, even a video analysis like this on any stock at any time. And what if you could tailor that analysis to your specific level of financial knowledge and the depth you want to explore in each key area?
That would be amazing.
Well, at stockanalytics.ai, we are building exactly that capability. But we're also adding an interactive interface where you can ask direct questions about the stock, a voice-controlled stock screener to find new opportunities, and a portfolio analyzer that helps you de-risk and stress test your current investments. Visit stockanalytics.ai today, check out our demo, and see what's possible. We've opened up the waiting list for beta users, offering 50% discounts and even opportunities to invest in the future of financial intelligence.
Wow, sign me up.
Sign up now at stockanalytics.ai, and now let's get back to the second half of our deep dive.
So we've looked at the business, the management, and the financials.
Yeah.
Now let's see how the market feels about Corcept. What's the overall sentiment?
It's been a bit of a wild ride. Over the past year, we've seen a generally upward trend in the stock price, but with some pretty dramatic swings. That huge surge we talked about at the beginning, the over 85% jump that happened right after they announced positive results from a phase 3 clinical trial for relacorilant in ovarian cancer.
Right.
Before that, the stock actually hit an all-time high in February of 2025. But then it dropped significantly after news of that lawsuit from the health insurers, and again after they lost that patent ruling against Teva. So it's clear that any news, especially anything about their clinical trials or legal battles, has a big impact on how the market values the stock.
So what are the analysts saying? Are they optimistic or cautious?
Most analysts seem to be pretty bullish on Corcept right now. The majority have buy or outperform ratings on the stock. Their average one-year price targets range from about $99.75 to $109.50, but some analysts are even more optimistic with targets as high as $150.
So overall, they see the stock going up.
Definitely. And you mentioned recent news having a big impact.
I did. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. That positive data from the phase 3 Rosella trial for relacorilant in ovarian cancer, that was the big driver behind that massive spike in the stock price. The market loved it.
Makes sense.
The FDA accepting their new drug application for relacorilant in hypercortisolism, that was seen as a positive sign too. But then on the flip side, you have the lawsuit from the health insurers and the loss in the Teva patent case. Those both sent the stock down. So yeah, the stock is super sensitive to any news that comes out.
What about some of those more technical indicators of market sentiment, like short interest and options activity?
Right. So short interest in Corcept is relatively high. Around 15% of the outstanding shares are sold short. That means a lot of investors are betting that the stock price will go down.
Interesting.
But a high short interest can actually set the stage for a short squeeze if good news comes out and the price jumps. Then all those short sellers have to scramble to buy the stock to cover their positions, and that can push the price up even further.
A self-fulfilling prophecy.
Kind of. And in the options market, there's a lot of activity across a wide range of strike prices, which tells us that traders are expecting some big price swings in the coming months. So the options data suggests a mix of bullish and bearish sentiment.
So a volatile stock with mostly positive analyst sentiment, but also a lot of investors betting against it. That's a complicated picture.
It is. So who actually owns the company? What's the ownership structure like?
Good question.
Well, the vast majority of Corcept's shares, around 82%, are held by institutional investors.
Big investment firms.
Exactly, like BlackRock and Vanguard. They're some of the biggest shareholders. That high level of institutional ownership usually means that these professional investors have done their homework and they believe in the company.
Okay. What about the company's insiders? How much do the management team and the board own?
Insiders own a decent chunk, around 11.44%. And that can be a good thing because it theoretically aligns the interests of management with those of the shareholders. But remember we talked about those recent insider stock sales?
Yes.
So that might raise some eyebrows?
Makes sense. Is ownership spread out or concentrated among a few big players?
It's pretty concentrated. The top 25 shareholders own about 72.56% of the company.
So a small group controls a large portion of the shares.
Exactly.
What about corporate governance? Do they have structures in place to protect shareholder interests?
Yeah, they have the standard stuff. A code of ethics, corporate governance guidelines, a mostly independent board of directors. They've also got committees like the audit committee, the compensation committee, and the governance committee, each with specific responsibilities. So they're trying to promote accountability and safeguard shareholder interests.
Sounds like they're checking all the boxes. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground. Let's talk about the big picture risks and opportunities for Corcept.
Okay, let's do a classic SWOT analysis.
Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats.
Exactly. So starting with strengths, they've got deep expertise in cortisol modulation. They are the first mover in some areas. With Korlym, they've got a big library of cortisol modulator compounds. Their pipeline, especially, relacorilant, looks very promising. Their financials are strong. They've got an experienced management team. They even have a robust employee assistance program.
That's a pretty solid list of strengths.
Right. But no company is perfect. On the weaknesses side, they're heavily reliant on Korlym for revenue, which is always a risk. They had that recent earnings miss, which is a bit concerning. The dazucorilant trial setback was a disappointment. And those employee reviews suggest there might be some cultural or morale issues within the company.
Okay, so what about opportunities? Where could they grow or expand?
Well, the market for Cushing's syndrome is expected to keep growing, so that's a natural opportunity for them. Relacorilant has the potential to be a blockbuster, not just in Cushing's, but also in ovarian and prostate cancer. There's also some evidence that hypercortisolism is more common in certain patient groups, like people with hard-to-control diabetes and resistant hypertension. So that could be another area for them to explore. And of course, there's always the potential to expand internationally.
It sounds like they've got a lot of options.
They do, but there are also some serious threats they need to address. First and foremost, the ongoing patent litigation with Teva. If Teva wins, They could start selling a generic version of Korlym, which would really hurt Corcept's revenue. And then there's that lawsuit from the health insurers. That could lead to big financial penalties and damage their reputation. They're also facing competition from other companies developing treatments for Cushing's syndrome. And like any pharma company, they're exposed to regulatory risks, drug pricing pressures, and the inherent risks of clinical trials. Plus, there's always the possibility of a broader economic downturn that could impact healthcare spending.
So to wrap things up, what are the key takeaways from our deep dive into Corcept Therapeutics?
Corcept is a financially strong company with a really promising pipeline. Relacorilant in particular has a lot of potential, especially with that recent positive trial data in ovarian cancer. However, they're also facing significant legal and ethical challenges related to their main product, Korlym, so it's a classic high-risk, high-reward situation.
Right. A lot of potential, but also a lot of uncertainty.
Exactly. So here's a question for you to think about. Given Corcept's volatile stock history and all of these potential advancements and risks, how do you weigh the promise of breakthrough therapies against the uncertainties of patent battles and ethical scrutiny? It's not an easy question to answer, but it's something you should definitely consider as you digest all this information.
I agree.
Evaluating a company like Corcept is complex. You have to look at both the good and the bad. So we encourage you to dig into the sources we've linked in the description. And stay tuned to see what happens with the FDA's decision on relacorilant and the outcome of those legal battles. If you want more in-depth stock analysis and deep dives like this, be sure to subscribe to the Stock Analytics AI YouTube channel.
Great advice.
And remember, this deep dive is based on the research that was available to us. Any investment decisions you make should be made with caution and after considering your own personal financial situation. Finally, we want to be transparent and let you know that artificial intelligence was used in the process of gathering and analyzing the source material for this deep dive.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for joining us.